so excited to introduce Samantha Wilcoxson. She's an American writer with British roots. When she's not reading or traveling, she enjoys spending time at the lake with her husband and 3 teenagers. The Plantagenet Embers series debuted with Plantagenet Princess, Tudor Queen, the story of Elizabeth of York, and it has been selected as an editor's choice in the Historical Novel Society and longlisted for the 2016 HNS Indie Award. Faithful Trader, the story of Margaret Pole, is the second novel in the trilogy, continuing the story of the Plantagenet remnant in Tudor times. And this novel has received 5 stars from the Reader's Favorite and a Discovering Diamond Award. And the recently released final installment in Plantagenet Embers, Queen of Martyrs, features Queen Mary I and her story of the Counter-Reformation in England. So Samantha, thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to have you. Can you tell me a little bit about what started your interest in this period and how you choose these people to write about that you choose?
Sure, thank you for inviting me, and I'm excited to be here too. And so starting to write this series, well, first of all, I never intended for it to be a series. I always enjoyed reading about the Wars of the Roses, and when I wanted to start writing, Elizabeth of York was somebody who really stood out to me as just an intriguing character who was always in the background. Nobody really focused on her, despite her really important relationship and place in history. So choosing her seemed really easy. And then once I got started, Margaret shows up in her story a little bit. Of course, they're cousins, and it just kind of carried on from there. And even after writing about Margaret, Mary was one who really snuck up on me. I had actually finished writing about Margaret when one of my beta readers said, "So Mary's next, right? We want to know what happened to Mary," because she, of course, is in Margaret's story because Margaret was her governess. So I just kind of said, no, I wasn't going to write about Mary at all. But when I started looking into the possibility, I became really fascinated with her and her story and how much more there is to her than what most people talk about, because most people just say, oh, Bloody Mary, she's horrible, right? And I found that I really didn't think she was horrible. She has a very tragic, sad, poignant story, and she was really a pleasure to write about, if I can say that about somebody who most people dislike. When you look further, deeper into her character, there are things about her to admire and sympathize with, and she lived at a very difficult time in history, and as England's first queen, I mean, her difficulties, it's really hard for us to imagine dealing with that along with the Reformation at the same time.
Yeah, you know, I've heard it said that Elizabeth was as successful as she was because she saw what Mary did first, you know, and if she hadn't seen marrying a foreign prince and, you know, all of that kind of stuff, that she saw these mistakes that Mary made, and so kind of have Mary defend.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the mistakes Mary made, because obviously she did make some. I don't mean to say she was perfect either, but also the things that she did right. You know, a lot of Elizabeth's language about how her relationship between herself and her kingdom, Mary said those things.
That comes right from Mary's, yeah, that's her speech at the Guildhall, right?
Exactly, yes. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. I mean, yes, there are admirable things about Elizabeth as well, but people don't realize that some of those things she did learn from her older sister.
Yeah. Okay, well, hopefully we can get into talking about her a bit too, but I want to start back at the very beginning with time-wise at least, and talk about Lady Margaret Beaufort, who was kind of another person who is sometimes has negative things said about them that maybe she doesn't always deserve. So can you tell me briefly what drew you to Lady Margaret Beaufort, and just kind of the overview of her, and especially the relationships that she had with her husbands, and the one in particular that's in your novella, and just a little bit of that?
Sure, yes. My novella, The Last Lancastrian, which I clearly don't have my Amazon profile very updated since it wasn't mentioned there. But yes, it features Margaret, and it's earlier. It's sort of a prequel to Plantagenet, Princess Tudor Queen. And when I decided to write, I have a couple more novellas coming out that are sort of just little side shoots of the series. And I decided to talk about Margaret first because, well, what you said about how people do have a negative impression of her sometimes. Not everyone. Some people really love Margaret, and I think that's great. But even myself personally in Plantagenet, Princess Tudor Queen, I didn't necessarily make her out to be the nicest person. And it's fiction, obviously, so I took some liberties with her character in some ways. And so the novella was sort of my way of just revealing a little bit more of her and proving to myself and my readers that I didn't actually think she was a villain. I wanted to show her as a young woman in love and in conflict, because she grew up and was a wife during the Wars of the Roses and a very central character in them because of her bloodline. So, so yeah, that's why I wanted to talk about her and maybe show a little more of her than I had previously, and even show where she might have gotten to the point that I had already previously put her, sort of like, I don't know, the new Star Wars trilogy explaining how Darth Vader became Darth Vader, I guess.
Yeah. So for people who maybe don't know as much about Lady Margaret or have just seen it seen her on TV shows or something like that, can you give us the kind of basic events of her life, and, because I love her, the redeeming qualities that she has?
She does have redeeming qualities, and she, considering the difficulties she had to deal with, I still don't think she was a bad person in any way. She was the last of the Beaufort line after all of the, well, through the Wars of the Roses, you know, the male lines were all extinguished. So she was in a position where she was the last, and Henry VI was her cousin and had reason to look to her as at least a potential heir because he went so long childless. And so that was good reason for him to marry her to his half-brother. And by then, Henry did have an infant son, but as we all know, having one infant son in the 15th century is no guarantee of anything. So, you know, Margaret was still in a position when she was married to Edmund Tudor that her son could, if whatever son they had, could become king. And maybe that was seen as a more far-fetched solution at that point, but of course we know that that is in fact what happened. So yeah, she went through a lot after that too. Of course, Edmund died before Henry Tudor was born, and she was very quickly married again. And then when Henry Stafford died, she was very quickly married again because she knew that she needed that protection of a spouse at that time. So she made a lot of quick, intelligent decisions for her own sake and that of her son.
And her son then went into exile, of course, and then became Henry VII. But that must have been so hard for her when, you know, when I was reading your novel or novella and seeing her in these different, having to make these decisions for her son and the love that she had for him and all of that, I was thinking about, he was 12 and she was only 12 or 13 when he was born. 13, right. I think. So right. She was only like 25 years old here making these decisions. I thought about myself at 25 years old. I would not have trusted myself to have made very wise decisions about, you know, in life or death kind of wartime situations like that. Right. And she handled it so intelligently. And I love how you portray the human side of her with that, and also the kind of anguish that she must have felt of how to make these kinds of decisions. And can you talk to me a little bit about how you kind of developed that for her and how you kind of helped her make those decisions?
Well, I think with all of the women that I write about, I just try to look at the historical events more as if I were trying to make those decisions myself, you know, rather than looking back and seeing how things ended up fitting together, but to look at, I mean, at the point where she married Henry Stafford, she's still a teenager. She's a teenage widow with a son, and to decide who to marry next. And that, fortunately for Margaret, became a very happy union, probably her happiest marriage, based on just some of the evidence of the way they celebrated their anniversary and that kind of thing. That was something I wanted to make sure I put in the novella, because, you know, we don't have love notes between Margaret Beaufort and any of her husbands left, but we can see, based on some of their habits of traveling together more than she did with others, and their anniversary parties, things like that, we can see that, okay, there's signs that this was really a happy marriage for her. But the decision she made to enter it was made when she was very, very young. And then even after he died, and her last marriage with Stanley, who that's the big famous controversial one there, you know, it was made very purposefully based on his position and where she knew she needed to be to prove her loyalty to the Yorkist kings. So she knew what she was doing.
Yeah. And then she even managed it all the way until Richard III participating in the coronation ceremonies. So she
Yes.
was really clever with how she did that. I mean,
she was very clever. And I think too that Richard underestimated her. And I think I talk about that more in Elizabeth Woodville's story than in Margaret's. But I do think that he didn't feel these women were a threat at all. And we know how well that went for him.
Yeah. Go ladies. Yeah, don't ever underestimate them. So then actually, that you've mentioned Elizabeth, and that takes me then to questions about your novella with Elizabeth. And I know it's not out yet, so I don't want to give too much away, but you do kind of explore the themes that I picked up on were exploring her relationship with her oldest daughter, with Elizabeth of York, and then also just her inner turmoil at not knowing what happened with her sons. So can you talk to me, maybe first talk a little bit about the relationship that she had with her daughter and how, yeah, kind of what that was like, and then we can move on to her sons.
Sure, yeah. You know, when I decided to write the next novella about Elizabeth Woodville, part of that was sort of like with Margaret, to kind of give her side of the story, because if you've read Plantagenet, Princess Tudor Queen, that's from Bess's, Elizabeth of York's, point of view. And so Elizabeth Woodville doesn't always come off as sympathetic or as kind as Bess, because I think Elizabeth of York, that's maybe more just how we think of her. She's the quiet, devoted, loyal, sweet princess, and that's not our general impression of Elizabeth Woodville. She's a strong go-getter, and, you know, not saying that's bad, but they're very different. And so I think Elizabeth came off as more negative in her scenes with her daughter, and so I wanted to show some of that from her point of view and show that maybe inside she would have loved to do something different. Maybe inside this was really tearing her apart to have to do to her daughter, or to have to make some of these decisions, but she couldn't come off that way. She couldn't sound uncertain. She couldn't say, well, I really love you, but this is what we need to do. She had to be a queen.
Yeah. And it all changed for her so quickly. She went from being I mean, and it had happened before in her life too, when Edward was exiled the first time and she was there in sanctuary, and here she is again, and it's just like you blink and it's all changed. And how do you still maintain your dignity, your queenliness, I suppose, in the face of that?
Right. And how does she do that without Edward? I mean, they despite imperfections in their relationship, I mean, they were in love, and he protected her and her family, and suddenly she had to face the world without him and try to do the best she could for her children. So I think just if we try to put ourselves in that position without knowing what happened after the fact, I mean, to just imagine her inner turmoil, that's what I wanted to put in her story.
Yeah. Yeah, and I really picked up on that, and just thinking about it, what had happened to her sons and the decisions. We sometimes look at her actions and use that as justification for or against our opinions of what might have happened to the princes. Like, oh, she couldn't, if she did this, then she released her daughters, then it, this and that. And I guess, like you were saying, well, can you talk to me a little bit about what that experience for her must have been like?
I mean, of course, I'm only guessing myself, but I just think that we do, like you said, take everything she did as evidence of something when she might not have been working with any more information than we are. She could have been just as uncertain about the fate of her sons as we still are today, but unlike us, who can just read about it and be like, oh, well, that's really interesting. She had to make decisions, really big, important decisions about what to do with her daughters and for herself and maybe she did have more information than I think she did. I don't know. But when I wrote her story, I went into it assuming that she didn't know either, and how hard it would have been to decide, do you leave Sanctuary? Do you stay there? Well, how long are you going to stay there then? You can't do that forever. Or when, news of this boy starts circulating court, do you believe that's your son, or do you just back up your daughter? She's queen now. Do you remain content with that? What does a mother do in that position? How do you choose one child over another when you don't even know if the other one is really there?
Yeah, absolutely. Must have been so, I can't even imagine. But even before then, we talked about not underestimating the women. Let's talk a little bit about those women and what they did and why they shouldn't have been underestimated, I suppose. Can you talk to me a little bit about this relationship that Lady Margaret and Elizabeth Woodville that they formed, and kind of the dynamics at play with each one of them, how they felt about each other, and just sort of how that developed?
Sure. I mean, I think we only have a really basic outline of that to go on, which for writing fiction is fine, but I don't want to put too much of my own take on things, because all we really know is, of course, that Margaret Beaufort was lady-in-waiting to Elizabeth Woodville when she was queen, and that after Edward died, some level of plotting went on between the two of them to ensure that Henry Tudor would invade, and that if he were successful, he would marry Elizabeth of York. So what the two of them actually thought of each other, I would love to know too. When I was writing about them, I tried to use what we do know to kind of surmise how a woman like Margaret Beaufort, who had been through a lot, been fighting for her son for a very, very long time, how she would view someone like Elizabeth Woodville, and just what that interaction would be like. They were both very strong-willed, purposeful women. So I imagine some clashing going on there, but also they both knew what they wanted and made sure it happened.
Yeah, yeah. And so then the plotting that we do know about, can you talk a little bit about how that played out and how they plotted?
Well, we do know that while Elizabeth was in Sanctuary with her daughters, that Margaret sent a doctor to go and visit Elizabeth. And so that is how they were able to send messages back and forth, agree to the betrothal of their children, and make that happen. So, and when I was writing Elizabeth's story about that, I still have her kind of uncertain, because just from her position in sanctuary, she's only getting so much news. So I tried to explore the idea that she might have some doubt about trusting Margaret Beaufort as being the only one reaching out to her at that point. So whether she really felt that way, I don't know, but just again, trying to put myself in her position, what would you think about that? This other woman with a son of her own, when Elizabeth is still at least hoping at that point that she has two sons of her own. What do you do with that?
Yeah. I love the feelings of the angst. I got that. It comes through. So you accomplished, if that was your mission, you accomplished that in that book.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah. And so then let me see what I have next here. Let's talk a little bit about Margaret Pole. We did kind of get to her. She does figure in here as, and it's interesting because I had actually bought your book when I did an episode on Margaret Pole when she was the Tudor Times Person of the Month, and I did a little episode on her, and I realized that you were one of the only fiction books about her, I think, and so it's sitting there on my Kindle, and I realized I was like, oh, I haven't read this yet, so I need to read that one. But what can you tell me about her life? There's things that we hear of her with the eventual execution of her, but that's kind of the only thing that a lot of people are familiar with her, that they've heard of her. What can you tell me about her life and why you chose to write about her?
Well, why I chose to write of her are for the reasons you've just said. Really, when you look for anything about her, I wasn't able to find anything either. And I guess she just struck me as the next person. After I had finished writing about Elizabeth of York, I thought, why aren't people talking about these women? These are amazing women. I mean, Margaret Pole had to grow up under a dynasty different from the one she had been born into. I mean, her father was executed, then her brother was executed, later her son is executed, and this is happening under different kings. I mean, of course, she herself ends up executed. I mean, it's just this crazy story. But then in the meantime, she is, very close friends with Henry VIII's first queen, Catherine of Aragon. She is governess to Princess Mary. She's Countess of Salisbury. I mean, I can't think of another figure with higher highs and lower lows than Margaret Pole. She's really amazing. And she, sort of like the women we've already talked about, was also just very strong. I mean, her husband died when she was quite young, leaving her with small children. And she had to decide how to deal with that under the reign of, King Henry VII first, who was not sympathetic to her family, more than he had to be, for good reason. And then Henry VIII, at first started out obviously having a very good relationship with her and is the one who raised her up until he didn't want to be married anymore. So yeah, she has a really interesting story that a lot of people just know that she's an old lady who was executed, and that's really a shame that that's all they know about her.
Yeah. So what was the most what was the most surprising thing that you learned about her? What did you learn about her that kind of struck you as an interesting tidbit that you can share?
That's a really good question. I loved exploring her relationship with her children, because even though her husband died while the children were young, she of course went on to try to arrange good positions for them, mostly marriages. And then of course Reginald became a cardinal, and he's one of my favorite people of all time. So I really liked kind of following those tracks with Ursula married into the Stafford family, which of course would have seemed like an excellent position for her. And then her husband's father was executed. as well. He was executed before any of the Poles. Well, not before Margaret's brother, but yeah, it's for that to all kind of start to fall apart around her. You know, Ursula's husband is in this bad position. She has a son die under circumstances that they're not recorded, but he was relatively young. Then she's got Geoffrey giving testimony against his brother. We have the whole Exeter conspiracy. So, you know, just looking into what happened with all of her kids. Because she could have just kind of held them back from court, and maybe she wanted to. At least when I tried to get into her head, I could imagine having some conflict. You know, do I just keep my kids away from all that? Do I marry them to nobodies? But then she's a Plantagenet. She's like a York princess. You know, that's not in her to just sit back and do that. So she did try to do her best for them, and she rose high herself, but it all in the end comes crashing down.
I often wonder why anybody wanted to be anywhere near that court. Like, I mean, I understand you're noble and so you want to go where the power is, but it like they can take it away really easily, and then you're really in a jam, you know?
Absolutely. Yes.
I would just like to retire somewhere like far away. I'll take like Penzance or somewhere in Devon. That would be lovely, and just they can do their thing.
Yeah, I think Margaret in the end might have felt the same way, wishing she had done that, but oh well.
Yeah, and she never remarried, did she?
She did not.
Because she kept all those titles in her own right, which was very unusual for the time, wasn't it?
Yes. Henry VIII is the one who created her Countess of Salisbury in her own right, and that had been an ancestral title, but had not been held for a while. So yeah, that was all in her own name.
So thinking about inner turmoil, her brother was executed in part for the Princess Catherine of Aragon to come to England, and then she became very close friends with Catherine of Aragon.
Right.
So how do you think these people were able to compartmentalize things like that? And with Elizabeth Woodville too, compartmentalizing this child, and maybe these two were dead, but I need to like do this. Can you talk a little bit about like how you explore that with your characters?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think in part it was just a different time and people knew that's what they had to do. I mean, when you grow up in a time of war and you see people switching sides, you see people dying, and some of it was just you did what you have to do. Maybe they were forced to do that a little bit more than we are. And so far as Catherine and Margaret go, I did in Faithful Traitor, I did have them talk about that at one point. And Catherine, you know, maybe at the time this whole arrangement was made, she sort of knew what was happening, but it's happening to people she doesn't know. It's just some part in a treaty that doesn't mean much to her until later she meets Margaret and realizes, wow, this is my friend's brother we were talking about. So I do kind of have them address that and just look at how Catherine's thoughts about that might have changed from this just being one of those necessary things to this was a real person and a real family affected by this.
Yeah. And she might not, to be fair, she might not have even known what, like, her father and her mother presumably were like negotiating that. And
yeah, she might not have even known. That's true. And even if she did, it wasn't her call, and she who knows if she would even thought about it at all.
Yeah, but it's just interesting then from Margaret's perspective to serve this queen that she might have held that, you know, like, oh, she's here because my brother's dead. And
right.
It's interesting. It's just interesting how these people were able to like square these things in their mind.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
really did have to just truly forgive and forget sometimes in a lot of situations just to do what they had to do to move forward.
Yeah. So who, and then I guess actually we have a little bit of time here. Let's talk a little bit about Mary, and then that kind of brings us full circle, I suppose.
All right.
Um, so tell me, tell me what you love about Mary, or what, you know, kind of what you grew to really admire her, and why we shouldn't just keep calling her Bloody Mary.
Sure. Um, you know, it will probably strike some people as a little bit odd, but I actually do admire Mary's faith. Despite
Mhm.
the executions and despite a lot of the bad things that happened because of it, her faith also led her to do some really great things. I mean, she stood up to Henry VIII, and how many people do that? Not very many. And that, not only that, but it's her dad. So she, even though she was kind of a more demure person than her mom was, she was still strong in her own way. She was not always in the best of health, but she stood up when people tried to take her crown away. She stood up and said, "No, that's mine." And she felt that because she felt that that was God's desire, that that was what was meant for her. And same thing with her marriage, even though that was probably her worst decision she made, she thought that that was what God was leading her to do. Everything that she did, she really was trying to do the right thing and was trying to follow her faith. And her the whole counter reformation in England wasn't because she was bitter or jealous or vengeful. It was because she thought it was her duty to bring the true faith to her people, to her subjects, who she considered her children. You know, she wanted to share eternal life with them. That was, it's hard for us to wrap our minds around it because that's not the way we think anymore. But that's the way Mary thought. She thought that this was vitally important to ensure the faith of her people. And no
Yeah.
matter what happened, she stood by that. So I mean, I really admire that about her.
And you know, it's interesting, the idea of us not being able to understand the mindset, and, you know, not wanting to put kind of modern thoughts on these people. I read that, you know, the idea of burning was actually considered a merciful way to die, because you got to experience the flames of hell while you were still alive in time to repent.
Exactly.
And yeah, and so the idea that, you know, in as much as we look at that and say that would have been a horrible way to go,
Right.
and it, I'm sure it was,
Right.
they're still done in a way, they kind of saw it as a mercy to give these people one last chance to repent. Ooh.
Right. And that's the way Mary would have seen it. I mean, there's other instances of her being merciful in other ways. When Wyatt's rebellion happened, you know, she could have executed anyone involved in that. And instead, she let many of them go. She had her sister imprisoned for being involved in conspiracy, and she always let her go. She may have not had a good relationship with Elizabeth, but she would never prosecute her the way some people encouraged her to do so, very much so. She definitely she was very merciful, but that's not the way we see her. And even like you said, the burnings, she wasn't thinking, oh, I'm going to give these people an excruciating death and teach them their lesson. She was thinking, I want these people to have a foretaste of hell and change their minds. And as horrible as that was, and as inconceivable as it is to our ideas, our modern ideas, that's really what she thought. She really did think that she was doing the best thing for her people.
I always feel so bad for her and her phantom pregnancies too, because it must have been just so awful and gut wrenching. Like there's bells in London that a son is born, and then it's like, oh, never mind, not. I'm just gonna
Right.
slink out here.
Yes,
Pretend it never happened.
right, her whole marriage was just one huge tragedy. I mean, it caused her to lose the love of her people. Because when she first came into London as queen, I mean, people adored her. People wanted Mary to be queen. It wasn't until she married Philip that everything started to fall apart, and then he wasn't even a good husband either. So
that was Elizabeth's lesson then, not to marry a jerk foreign prince.
Which is true. It led to problems of a different sort, but yeah, she did learn not to marry Philip at least.
Yeah. Well, this has been so much fun. I love hearing all of these stories of these women, and I love the people who are writing and, you know, exploring their lives, because often we just think of they're on the sidelines having babies and knitting or something. No, not knit, no, whatever.
I think it might have been embroidering.
Exactly. So, you know, I love people showing them with the power that they were able to carve out for themselves, and, you know, how they were able to do that. So thank you so much for doing that. Where can people learn more about your work then?
Well, I have a blog. It's samanthawilcoxson.blogspot.com. I'm on Twitter. You can search for my name, or my handle is Carpe Librum. And I have a Facebook page. It's Plantagenet Embers. So any of those, or of course I'm on Amazon.
Awesome. So thank you so much for being here and for being part of this event. I've been so